Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. It is day 4,107 of us being in business event. We are so thrilled to welcome back Katherine Addison, who no matter whether she's writing as Katherine Addison or Sarah Monette, always gets rave reviews. She is going to be interviewed once again because she was here. I just learned the exact date because I do have that somewhere. I didn't look it up right. In 2015, when she was with Mary Robinette Kowal in conversation with our arts and book editor, Jim Higgins. He called The Goblin Emperor one of his top books of the decade. And now it's a new decade, and this book is definitely, from what I've talked to Jim, in the running. We'll learn more about both, but I'm going to hand it over to Jim Higgins and Katherine Addison. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Daniel, and welcome back to Milwaukee.
Thank you, Jim.
And Daniel wasn't being hyperbolic about my love of The Goblin Emperor. I was just reading some of it today to get ready for tonight and remembering, God, I really love this book. I couldn't pronounce too many of the names in it, but I really love this book. But we'll talk about that later. Would you mind, for people who haven't seen your book yet, just briefly give them the elevator pitch on your book, and then if you're willing to read a little bit just to whet our appetite, then we can talk.
Sure. I even have my copy to hand. So The Angel of the Crows is a Sherlock Holmes pastiche with angels and vampires and werewolves and ghouls and hellhounds and Jack the Ripper, which is basically exactly what I told my editor when she asked me what I was working on. And she turned around and said, okay, we'll buy that. So it takes place in 1888 in a London that is mostly like ours, but not quite. And our protagonist is Dr. J.H. Doyle, who has just returned from Afghanistan with a terrible wound from a fallen angel, because we have fallen angels and they are very bad news. And I think if I can find it, I want to read the section where Doyle meets Crow for the first time. Yes, here. It's chapter 2. So no particular spoilers. London is no place for an invalid, nor for anyone required by the exigencies of fate to be thrifty. And I did not love the city with either maudlin or clear-eyed passion. But one thing London possesses in greater quantity than any other location in England, Scotland, or the Alliance of Ireland, and that is privacy. One rebuffs the avid curiosity of the country at one's peril, but city dwellers have so many more opportunities to pry among so many strangers whom they will never see again, that one missed chance is hardly worth the notice. I became more than ever determined to stay in London. But of course, the natural perversity of all things dictated that the more reasons I had to stay in London, the more beset with difficulties that prospect seemed to be. I could not afford London on my own, not with my health still so precarious that I could not hope to find regular employment, but finding someone to share lodgings seemed every bit as chimerical a goal. Although armed forces training made me at least capable of sharing my living space with another person, I harbored no illusions about the difficulties my temperament would make for anyone trying to share their living space with me. A natural tendency toward the autocratic had not been curbed by either my experiences as a surgeon or as a serving officer. And I had been accused more than once of being dour and pedantic and impossible to live with. Added to that were the new difficulties caused by and associated with my injury. Pain made me short-tempered, and I now had a large and ugly secret to hide. I had a good deal of practice in keeping secrets, but this one. The conundrum remained unsolved, my savings dwindling at an alarming rate, but not yet extinguished, on the day the doctors pronounced me healed, or as close as they thought me likely to come, and I decided on the strength of it to have a drink at the Criterion Bar, where once I had felt myself to be the ruler of all creation. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," I said, saluting the indifferent bartender with my glass, and a voice behind me said incredulously, "Doyle? That's never Johnny Doyle." I swung around and cried, "Young Stamford," in disbelieving delight. Stamford, of course, was not young. He had been middle-aged when we struggled through human anatomy together, and he had to be nearly 60 now, any more than my name was Johnny. But the sophomoric humor of medical students had bestowed fitting sobriquets: young Stamford, who was old enough to be our father, and Johnny, in retribution for my refusal to reveal more of my given names than my initials. And it could have been much worse. Stamford and I shook hands, and he said, "Good gracious, Doyle, what have you been doing with yourself?" "I am only recently returned from Afghanistan," I said, "and I have been devoting my attention to the question of whether there is a man in London mad enough to share lodgings with me." I meant it mostly as a joke, for Stamford had known me well enough to appreciate it, but instead of laughing, he got a very odd expression on his face and said, "Do you know, you're the second person today to say that to me. Who was the first?" His expression became assessing. "I'm not at all sure. But then you might just be cold-blooded enough to put up with him. But who is this paragon? One of those terrifying German lecturers?" "Nothing like that," Stamford said cheerfully. He consulted his watch. "If you care to, you can come along and meet him, and it will spare me trying to explain." We reached Bart's, and Stamford led me to one of the chemistry laboratories. It was deserted except for a man hunched over a lab bench in the back of the room. As we came in, he straightened up, and my first puzzled thought was, why is he wearing an overcoat in here? But then, as he turned towards us, the overcoat flexed around him, spreading slightly before pulling back in, and I realized that it wasn't an overcoat at all, but a pair of coal-black wings, crow's wings, and the man wasn't a man, but an angel. I looked at Stamford in confusion. Is that the angel of St. Bartholomew's? I thought surely I remembered him? Oh, good Lord, no. But before he could explain, the angel was striding toward us, his wings spreading and mantling around him. "Human blood," he said. "I need a drop of human blood." "Oh, no, you don't," Stamford said, putting his hands protectively behind his back. "If you're turning vampire, I don't want any part of it." "Don't be ridiculous," the angel said, and turned his attention to me. He was tall but slight built, with an angel's long, light bones. His complexion was marble white, his hair white and as fine as a child's, and his eyes so pale that they seemed transparent and lit from within, although nothing could have been farther from the terrible light of the fallen's eyes. He wore a subdued fog-gray suit. "Human blood," he said again. He had a lovely voice, clear and measured and perfect enunciation. "I only need a drop. I promise it isn't for occult purposes of any kind." "Then why do you want it?" I said. Stamford said, "Don't get him started." The angel hunched both shoulder and wing, which quite effectively created a barrier between Stamford and the two of us, and said, "It's a question of stains, you see." "Stains," said I. "Yes, after a few days, the police have no means of determining whether a particular stain, say on a shirt cuff, is blood or rust or perhaps paint, and they can't distinguish between human blood and animal blood at all. I'm working to find a reagent that will change color in the presence of hemoglobin, but not in the presence of other similarly colored substances. I think I've got it, but I can't test it without a drop of human blood." He looked at me beseechingly. I saw that despite the looming darkness of his wings, which made him look taller, we were very much of a height. It was a bizarre request, but not an unreasonable one, even if it did seem oddly personal. And no matter what the metaphysicum morbi had done to me, I was still human. "All right," I said, "but I want to watch this test of yours." His smile made his rather beaky face quite beautiful. "Of course, here, I have a clean bodkin just over here." He did not actually grab my hand to drag me across the laboratory, but it was obviously a very near-run thing. "Here, a beaker and a liter of distilled water. Here, your finger in the bodkin. Just a drop, really, I was being accurate. And I've got a bit of sticking plaster ready." His enthusiasm was weirdly touching, and more than a little contagious. I pricked my finger and pressed a drop of blood into his beaker, then applied the sticking plaster and watched as he stirred the water vigorously until the blood was invisible. There, he said, undetectable. But now if we just... He picked up a small phial from the bench. Its contents were equally colorless, and when he tipped a drop into the beaker, it looked at first as if he had simply added water to water. Come on, he muttered, stirring vigorously once again. Then the liquid clouded up, and as we watched, a bluish-green sediment began to precipitate at the bottom of the beaker. Blood! The angel shrieked in delight, and behind us, where I had forgotten about him, Stamford laughed.
That's great. So you've taken a very famous scene from Sherlock Holmes, and
Yes.
we recognize it, but it's also very different, and we already see the character of the Holmes, the figure is very different too. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to write this book, Katherine?
So I had a long stretch, both before and after The Goblin Emperor was published, where I was having a lot of trouble writing, and no ideas seemed to work, and nothing seemed like it was any good. And then I had this crazy idea about Angels and Sherlock, the BBC show with Benedict Cumberbatch. And I thought, well, this is nuts, but I'm not writing anything else. So I started writing that, but my own deepest love is for the Arthur Conan Doyle stories. So it went very quickly from being about Sherlock and John to being about Holmes and Watson. But the idea of him being a slightly fallen angel was from something in Sherlock. It's one of the epigraphs where Sherlock says in the Reichenbach Fall, I may be on the side of the angels, but don't think for 1 second that I am one of them, which I took and turned around backwards and ended up with Crow, who is part of Holmes. There's a part of Holmes that is this madly enthusiastic experimenter and gets excited about mud stains and cigarette ashes and things like that. And I just thought we never see that part of him in any of the adaptations I'm familiar with. It's always the cold, logical, rational Holmes that we see. And I thought it would be fun to write about this enthusiastic Holmes instead. And it just kept going. It was the easiest book I've ever written.
I love the enthusiasm of Crow, and his character does. Crow's character does seem to really go off in directions we don't always see in other adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. I hadn't encountered wing fic before, but in your afterword to the book, you talk about a kind of fan fiction where characters have wings.
Yep.
Are those other stories like yours, or
No.
what do people do with those things when the characters have wings? Or maybe we shouldn't say here in a family forum, but
no, they can really be. There's a wide variety of stories. Ones where the characters are angels and that's why they have wings. Ones where no, they're just winged humans. Ones where the wings are invisible to everyone except 1 or 2 people. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful testament to the human imagination.
Yeah.
How many different ways there are to write about people with wings. But no, none of them, or at least I should say none that I have seen, are like this book at all.
Now, as you're a professional writer with very high standards, so is there any anxiety of influence about sitting down to write Sherlock Holmes-ish stories, about writing in that universe?
Yes, of course there is. I had not intended to publish this. I was just writing it for me, but it was the only thing I was writing. And when my editor asked me about, what are you working on? This was the only thing I had that I could even say, well, I've got about 10,000 words of this crazy Sherlock Holmes thing with angels and werewolves and vampires and Jack the Ripper. And she basically pitched my own book to me and bought it. So there is a lot of anxiety, but also it was something, again, that was fun to do. It was fun to play with that voice. I'm not as good at it as Arthur Conan Doyle is, but I enjoyed the effort.
Well, we're lucky you work for a publisher that you can't bring too weird an idea to. Is that right? You can't go to tour with any idea where say, well, no one's ever put those two things together before. Tour loves that sort of book.
Yep.
To talk about Doyle for a minute, I thought that I've read Holmes and Watson stories by other folks in addition to the canon, and I think you go to a deeper and darker and more troubled place with Doyle than a lot of people do with that character, and I salute you for it. That I think even in the canon, he's returned from Afghanistan with a wound, but that wound doesn't factor into all those stories. But you took that wound very seriously. We want to talk a little bit about your decision on how you treated Doyle.
Well, I was thinking about I was thinking about war, and thinking about what war is really like, instead of what polite Victorian society claimed that war was. And I thought that, well, there would have to be, and we know there are always serious repercussions for young men who go to war, even if they come back without any injuries. So I was interested in sort of a more a darker, but a more nuanced, I guess maybe is the word I want, approach to Watson's background. Watson's background is very, very unnuanced, and basically exists only when Conan Doyle wants it to. I wanted to give my Doyle a background that was actually part of the story. The way that, in human lives, the things we do always carry forward with us into the next part of the next thing that we do.
And I think he's an heroic character for that. Doyle has to, he's always having to face either his physical limitations or the possible shame of his secrets being covered, and he keeps going.
Yes.
Now, how did you write this book? Were you making it up as you went along? Did you work out the universe in advance? How did that go?
Well, I realized pretty early on that I wanted to retell Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four, and The Hound of the Baskervilles, leaving off The Valley of Fear because I don't like it, which I can do because I was writing this for me. But I didn't have anything. I wanted to make it a novel instead of 3 separate stories, although it's a very episodic novel. which was where Jack the Ripper came in, because I've also done a lot of reading about Jack the Ripper, and the timeline there provides these gaps between the murders that you need to fill with something. And so they came together in a very synchronistic way that was kind of hard to pull off. But yeah, I generally make things up as I go along. So I didn't work out much of the world aside from what's in the book. So I think I had a long passage about hemophages and vampires that a friend who read it in draft for me said, this is just you explaining this to yourself. We don't need it. And I looked and they were right. I said, okay, yes, and cut it. But mostly, no, I don't do a lot of work outside of writing the book.
Now, my memory might be off on this, but it felt like when I was reading it, but every other chapter you brought in a new kind of supernatural entity, or as I've been calling him privately to myself, critter, a new kind of supernatural critter comes in about. And I think somewhere you wrote this is your kitchen sink novel.
Yes, it is. This is the one where I just threw in everything I thought was interesting.
So I wanted to ask you about a couple kinds of your occult creatures. Angels, we come back to those. Werewolves, vampires, and forgive me that your vampire world makes me think fondly of Elizabeth Bear's New Amsterdam books, and your buddy and your collaborator.
Yes.
How much I love those books. Hemophages are they like living blood?
So the way I sort of set it up is that there's angels, vampires, werewolves, and ghouls, although we don't see them barely at all. And then there's what happens to human beings when they get too close to the fallen, or they get too close to someone who's been possessed by a demon, which is the metaphysicum morbi, which turns them into hemophages. Oh God, I'm blanking on the second one.
Necrophages?
Thank you. Hemophages, necrophages, and hellhounds as a sort of the skewed parallel of the naturally occurring supernatural creatures. So hemophages are they're like vampires, but they're more like vampires on steroids. They've got much more dramatic fangs, and they can't just bite people. They rip the throat out because their teeth are so terrible. And necrophages are like ghouls who eat dead bodies when they can find them.
You're carrion eaters.
Yes, carrion eaters. And then the hellhounds are like are the equivalent of werewolves. Hellhounds, of course, are also that's a quote from The Hound of the Baskervilles. That's what they call the hound, is a hellhound. So that was on purpose.
And for some of us who are music people, we have Robert Johnson songs now running through our brains of hellhounds on our trail. So
yes.
So in the world there, and all these different entities kind of live in maybe an uneasy détente with regular people, and there's a registry and people who live underground and all this stuff. So we have angels who are the angels of different buildings or dominions.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the nameless, who were kind of unemployed angels. And that was a really touching part of the story. Would you talk about your angelology here? How that works?
So angels in this universe are more like the Roman idea of the genius loci, the spirit of a place. They are all bound to places. They have habitations and therefore names, and dominions. And if you don't have a habitation, well, either you've fallen, in which case you are a dreadful and demonic figure that everyone is terrified of, or you are one of the nameless. You don't have a name, you don't have a habitation, so you're sort of scudding around London like dead leaves, waiting for a place to garner enough of whatever it is that makes it into a place that has an angel for you to be attracted there and to gain a name. So it's a very, the angelology is not at all like any real world angelology. It's completely my own.
And this may be something that only occurs to me, but I felt at times there were two kinds of nameless in this story. There were the angels who are nameless, and then there are the women who are victims of crimes in this universe. And especially Crow has a great deal of compassion, I think, for both kinds of individuals.
Yes, I think that's a good, I'm not sure I can claim I did that on purpose, but I think it's a good observation.
When I read a book with supernatural characters and this is probably years of Catholic school, I sometimes think, okay, well, how does God fit into this? Or where do we go? And, what's the ultimate background of this? And you at least allude to the belief of some entities in this book that there is a God or something. You don't dismiss it. You don't spend a lot of time on it, but at least with the impression that some characters in this world are thinking about that in the midst of all this other stuff.
Yeah. Angels aren't only Christian. There's a Jewish angel who shows up, and there are similar similar spirits in other religions that they just happen in Western Europe. They take the form of angels. Yeah. And they at least have theories about an ultimate power that they feel very strongly about.
And the angel of the great synagogue was a wonderful angel, so I could easily spend more time with that angel.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I like him too.
Yes. Let's turn direction here, and I should point out to people who haven't read the book yet, there are no big info dumps in this book. That Katherine does this very smoothly in introducing these different entities, and the questions come from places that seem natural questions of the characters. What's your fascination with the Ripper, or the person we call the Ripper? And then we'll get to that.
Yeah. I like true crime. I read a lot of true crime. I think down at the bottom of it all, I'm a horror writer, and I read things for pleasure that make my husband look at me like, "Are you sure?" And I got interested in Jack the Ripper a while ago, and I didn't know why. I didn't have a reason. I just was like, "Oh, okay, I'll read books on Jack the Ripper now." And I got interested more and more in less in whoever Jack the Ripper was, which is something we don't know and never will, and more interested in the investigation of Jack the Ripper and what happened with the newspapers and the various crazy theories that have been advanced since to account for who he might be. And I had then when I came to write this book, it was like, oh, well, that's what I was reading that for.
Do you have a theory on who the Ripper was?
My theory is really what's in the book. I mean, aside from the fact where things don't go according to the historical model at the end, but some ordinary little man. Nobody looked at him twice.
A powerful part of the book I felt was Crow's anger about the name being given to the Ripper as a way, a thing that ennobles or empowers him that he doesn't deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Really almost making him in a kind of hero, and that pushes you further away from considering the women that he killed.
Right. Yes, and that was one of the things about working as I was working in this, from the police investigations and what's in the newspapers. Everything Crow reads in the newspaper is something that was really in the newspaper. So the newspapers weren't paying a lot of attention to his victims, just another unfortunate, horribly murdered. They were much more concerned with him, and of course with the fear that he'd start going after respectable women next.
As a newspaper guy, you have me torn here because, of course, newspapers are abominable in this thing, and just as conspiracy-ridden as like TV is now. But on the other hand, everyone's reading them all the time, so I don't know. I don't know whether to feel happy or anguished about that part. So I did listen today to your Tor Instagram takeover,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things you talked about was using Google Earth in writing this book. Would you talk a bit about what you did with that?
I used Google Earth to figure out where things were in Whitechapel in relationship to each other. It's not perfect, of course, because things have changed since 1888, but it did give me a sense of how little distance there was really between the Great Synagogue and Mitre Square, for instance. And also just a sense of sort of physically, I have never been to London, so I figured London out by reading and research, and Google Earth helped a lot with that.
Do you have favorite books about London?
Aside from Sherlock Holmes, which is the obvious, think for a minute.
Desiree's writing this down and going immediately to order it as soon as you say what it is.
I read a lot of children's books that took place in London, like Frances Hodgson Burnett and A Little Princess, which is very London-y.
Yes.
And no. Oh, I'm drawing a blank.
That's okay. Let me switch angles on you. So this wonderful book, which you've spent, quite a bit of time on.
Yeah.
It's come out during a pandemic, a quarantine, and a protest movement. And
yep.
So as a writer, how does it feel to be landing during that time period, and what's that like?
Well, like the rest of 2020, it's really weird. I mean, I think in some ways, to look for the silver lining, it's great. I mean, I'm doing events at bookstores that I would never otherwise have the chance to go to. The one in New Orleans last week, and one in Grand Rapids, and I think one out in California. So the virtual book visit thing has been really great. Otherwise, no, this is not ideal. I'm just hoping that people still want to read books in their quarantine.
They do in our house, believe me. My daughter's been burning through every unread book on her shelves, so we are here. I remembered that I wanted to ask you: are there any secondary characters in The Angel of the Crows that really came to life for you, or you felt afterwards, wow, I really, more came out of that than I was expecting?
Mary Morstan turned into much more of a character than I was expecting her to. She turned out, I mean, partly that's I was doing a lot of different things with the Holmes stories, and one of them was giving the women better parts, because women don't get to do very much in Victorian fiction. But she turned out to be a lady with strong opinions, and not afraid to share them. So that was great. I also became very fond of the Hebron family in the mashup of the Yellow Face and the Copper Beeches. They were all fabulous.
You're talking about Mary reminds me of a very powerful line, and I won't say what character said it, but I want to quote it back to you. To be alone and friendless as a man is still far better than to be alone and friendless as a woman. And that one, that was a powerful line in the story, just about the conditions that women lived in that time period.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing that Jack the Ripper sort of plays on, is just how awful it was to be alone and friendless and a woman in London. It made you easy pickings for him.
So do you see any common ground between The Angel of the Crows and The Goblin Emperor, your previous novel?
They are very different books, which was intentional. The Goblin Emperor is a very claustrophobic, sort of very tightly wound book that all takes place in the same place and is full of machinations and political maneuvering, and just generally very tightly knit together. And this is a much more sprawly thing, where you have London, and then you go down to Dartmoor, and you have angels, and all of these other characters from widely different socioeconomic backgrounds too, unlike in the Goblin Emperor, where you only see, the top 10% of the society. I would hope that both books are, in some ways, I think both books are about friendship, and the way that a friendship doesn't have to be traditional in order to be very meaningful for both parties.
That's a great summary of the Crow and Doyle relationship right there. Because I I don't want to say what happens, but I certainly leave the feeling it's almost like the end of Casablanca, where you could see the two of them walking off, and but the beautiful friendship continuing.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the next book we're going to get to see from you at some point in the future?
The next book you will see from me is The Witness for the Dead, which is in the same universe as The Goblin Emperor. It is about Kelleher, the witness for the dead, obviously, and it's a murder mystery.
Now, I was just reading that part of The Goblin Emperor today. Is that the kind of witness that is from the clerical side as opposed to the investigative side? Or is that not a question you can answer for me?
Well, Kelleher is one of the things I think the archprelate is trying to do is to get witnesses who can actually speak to the dead to be more investigative. So Kelleher is sort of both.
And what have you read or listened to recently that you'd recommend to people?
I read a great book by Sarah Churchwell, which is called Careless People. It's nonfiction. It's about F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, and it's about the 1920s in New York, and it's about the Great Gatsby, and it's about I've forgotten their names, but the murder case that was part of Fitzgerald's inspiration for writing Gatsby. And she goes back and forth between these quite different ideas just seamlessly. It's a very good book, I think. And what was the other one I just read?
Did I hear you mention on the Instagram the Madman and the Professor?
Yes, I did just read that, which is about the Oxford English Dictionary and the 70-year process of putting it together, and the fact that one of the people who did the most valiant work for them was a gentleman in Broadmoor who was a paranoid schizophrenic, but when he wasn't being a paranoid schizophrenic, he was right on top of this thing about words. That was a good book too.
That's one where I've listened a couple times on road trips to the audiobook version of that. That's narrated by Simon Winchester. So Daniel, that's a good one to get in the store. The audiobook of The Madman and the Professor. Do you have any audience questions for us, or questions from you, Daniel?
Do we have any questions tonight? Should plant people for these. It's always.
I'll ask one while people are thinking.
Oh yes.
I forgot to ask Catherine this. Do you have a favorite Holmes story from the canon?
The Speckled Band. It's the first one that my father read to me when I was about 7. It scared the living daylights out of me.
Yeah, that's probably not the first one I would pick it for 7. I might go with the Blue Carbuncle maybe for some. But wow, and the Speckled Band does get remixed in your novel too. So.
It does. I couldn't write a novel that was a Sherlock Holmes pastiche and not have the Speckled Band in it somewhere.
All right, we have a question from Nick Stover. Nick, if you'd like to ask your question.
Alert, audio now on mute. From Julie.
I wanted to say how much Doyle meant to me, both as a disabled and a queer person who very much, gets on with life, but definitely does have these moments. There's a moment where he's kneeling by Drebber's body, and he has to bow his pride a bit and ask for a hand up. And that was just really, really powerful. The fact that he could ask for that, receive it, and then very much go on to be a competent professional. That meant a great deal. And I thought that was an amazing thematic theme that you put in. And I wondered, was that deliberate, or was it just something that grew out of wanting a really three-dimensional character?
Yeah, that was something that came from really thinking through what had happened to Doyle, and really thinking about the consequences, which, as we were saying earlier, Conan Doyle doesn't bother with.
No.
But I did. I wanted to sort of think through what all of the consequences would be, and some of them are that, yes, it's a disability. It doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient. So that was, and that was something that I also wanted to do with Doyle, was to have someone who has a number of problems, some of which are spoilers, but have that not be the point of the story. To let to let this character be who they are and still be in a story that's not just focused on that.
It meant so much. I was really grateful.
Thanks, Nick. We have a question from Julia K, who asks you, why Angel of the Crows when there's only one crow?
Well, it sounds better. I don't have a really well articulated reason for that, aside from the fact that I think Crow thinks of himself as the angel of London, and also the angel of the carrion birds that nobody wants around, since that was what he was for a while, was just this weird angel that kept showing up at crime scenes, and the police officers didn't know what to do with.
It does make a wonderfully dramatic entrance line for Crow when he comes into places. I'm Crow, I'm the angel of London. And
Yes.
you could just see that scene in the movie, when he just dramatically storms into a place.
Yes.
Catherine, reader wanted to know that it feels to him like the book sets up for a sequel. And is that something that could happen?
It would be really difficult, because I've said what I have to say about Sherlock Holmes, I think, in this book, and I don't know what I'd do for a sequel.
There's not a Mycroft Crow waiting out there somewhere? Because he doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Except insofar as apparently Crow thinks the angel of Whitehall and the angel of the Great Synagogue are his family. So
I know how I felt that I delayed reading the very last chapter because I didn't want the book to end and the adventures to be done. So I always take that as a sign when people ask for a sequel that they love the book that much. They don't want the love to die. So
yeah, no, I completely understand why people hope for sequels, but this book in particular, I don't know how I'd do it.
Yes, you can only really take it as a compliment, and then when it comes out, they'll say, well, we didn't like it as much as the first book. But anyway, what a wonderful evening. Jim Higgins, arts book editor of the Journal Sentinel, had a wonderful review of Angel of the Crows. You can link to it. I think that's also on our website. We're looking forward to the next Katherine Addison book. And we're so honored that we could have you here tonight to talk about Angel of the Crows. Thank you so much to Tor and Desiree for helping put this together. And thank all of you for coming, because we wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you. Hope to see you at another event. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Ray.
Yay. Wonderful.